Even Pulitzer Prize winners break it down for you. Before we get started, the latest polls show people love public radio, but will all those opinion votes get counted? Will you get your pledge ballot in on time? This is the final few hours of this tiny 3-day pledge drive. So please, let's meet this goal, pay the bills, and get on to covering this election season and everything else bearing down on us. Here's what to do. Go to KUOW.org and make a secure donation. I recommend the monthly evergreen tool, meaning you just click that and your contribution is made once a month automatically. One less thing to think about. If you like the telephone, well, so do I. Give us a call, 206-543-9595. That's 543-9595. You can text to us. Text KUOW. That's it, KUOW to the number 41444. That's 41444. Or your smart speaker can do all this for you. Thank you for becoming a member, a financial contributor on this final day of the teeny weeny autumn 3-day pledge drive. Thank you for your support. Again, I'm Bill Radke. Glad to have you here on the Week in Review. I am joined by my reporter super friends from Q13, reporter Jennifer Lee. Hi, Jennifer.
Hey, Bill. Hi, everyone.
Good to have you here. David Kroman, reporter for Crosscut. Good to talk with you again. Hey, David.
Hi, Bill.
And Eli Sanders from not the Stranger, the Wild West newsletter. Eli, what's happening?
I recently left the Stranger and have taken a leap into the email newsletter Yonder. I am writing an email newsletter on Substack called Wild West. If that is a totally incomprehensible.
Eli, you're breaking up a little. Let's work on that. We'll get you some technical advice in your ear, but that's the Wild West newsletter. And you just heard Eli use the word yonder. He may be using Wild West phrases just like that. But I know that actually he's covering in this newsletter, Eli is covering issues around the internet, the Wild West of the internet, and how the internet is being...
You can just search for Eli Sanders and the internet.
Checking facts or not checking facts. So we'll talk a bit more about that down the road. Okay, let's move on. Let's begin this week with our top story this week, which is that Seattle has started defunding the police. The city council this week overrode the mayor and moved forward with cuts to the Seattle Police Department and investments in some non-policing solutions. City Council President Lorena Gonzalez said it was a matter of principle.
I want to be able to tell my daughter, who I'm currently holding in my arms, that I did the right thing and that I voted on the right side of history.
Jennifer, what did the city council vote to cut this week as they overrode the mayor?
There were actually 3 council bills related to the 2020 Seattle budget. And the one that I think a lot of people had their focus on was the council bill related to SPD. So about $3.4 million will be cut from the department. Originally, they were supposed to be cuts to about 100 officers, the harbor unit, the navigation team. So this was something that was obviously very controversial. There were 90 minutes of public comment from people who were phoning in from all parts of Seattle, including from outside even Councilmember Andrew Lewis's home. So this was something that has been a hot topic since the summertime and continued to be so. Mayor Durkin had vetoed it, and there were even talks about backup legislation if this override vote didn't happen. But yeah, that's what ended up happening. And I will tell you, till the very end, opinions were packed in this meeting. And there were some butting of heads again that we saw amongst council members as well.
Yes, that's true. Well, it was a big deal. As you said, it was a hot topic this summer with some council members, the majority of council members, saying yes to protesters' activist demand to cut 50% from the Seattle Police Department. But David, instead, it's like 7%, at least for now. Why the big change? Why did we go from a declaration of a 50% police department cut down to, for the 2020 budget, a cut of $3 million out of $400 million, 7%.
Yeah, I mean, there were some early headlines that said that, there's a, quote, veto-proof majority of council members who are ready to cut the police department by 50%, that I think were maybe a little bit misleading early on. I think there was some sort of general support for the idea of getting to something like that eventually. There were a few council members who were ready to do it right away, specifically Council Member Shama Sawan. But it also became clear that there were certain things that would make it really difficult to cut 50% of the police department this year, namely that a lot of the discretionary spending, or the sort of the spending that didn't have anything to do with personnel, had already been spent for this year. So the department had already spent all of its money on overtime, had already spent all of its money budgeted for equipment and things like that. So that cutting 50% of the rest of the 2020 budget for the police department would mean cutting a lot more than 50% of the personnel who work for the police department. It would have been pretty dramatic. And so I think the council realized that. They realized that there were some fairly thorny labor issues that were going to be pretty difficult to get around. And so it became, it transferred from, we're going to cut 50% of the police department, to we're making a, quote, down payment toward creating this sort of new and what they say is a better public safety system. And so we heard that quite a bit, that this is just the beginning, and we're going to keep doing more.
So Eli, what's the lesson in your opinion?
Well, taking the long view, I think one of the lessons is that the political leaders in this city, and I include the mayor and all the members of the city council, have been way behind the curve on coming up with concrete plans for addressing the calls for better policing in this city. We had a mayoral election not too long ago, and council elections very recently. And since the killing of George Floyd, obviously the cry for really rapid reform has increased. But it's just striking to me that a lot of the chaos that we're seeing between the council and the mayor and on the council right now is the result of no one having a plan on the shelf to say, yeah, you want reform? I've got it right here. I've been talking about it for years. No one had a workable plan on the shelf that could get a majority of the council, to get the mayor's approval, that they were ready to run with. And that's a big failing, I think, of our local leaders.
Jennifer, this has been described as a down payment. We've got the big next event is that we're going to come up with a budget for next year, because a lot of this year's budget, it's been spent, but the mayor's going to come on Tuesday, I think, and propose a 2021 budget. If this has just been the down payment part of it, what do you expect to happen? How much more police cutting and other investments do you expect?
I think ultimately it's yet to be seen. I think we have to wait to see exactly what Mayor Durkin presents. But, just based on the information I've heard, she is promising to invest about $100 million into Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities to show support to them, to also, bolster and strengthen public health and safety. But based on what we've seen in recent months, and, kind of going back to what Eli said about a concrete plan, I think that is a criticism that this council has faced about making promises and moves without really setting the table for a real concrete future plan. So I think it's going to be really telling. I think there are going to be some decisions made, and maybe again, like we saw in the past few months with the 2020 fiscal budget, where they might have to go back and work on it again. And it's going to be a long process, especially since the city is also facing a major deficit, multi-$100 million deficit.
David Kroman, you came up in my conversation with the mayor yesterday because she had said that because of the city's labor contract with the police officers union, the officers who get laid off, because they're going to cut 100 positions through layoffs and attrition, the officers let go will be the newer ones who are more likely to be people of color. And you had told me on the air this week, well, the labor contract doesn't actually require that. And I brought that to Mayor Durkin yesterday, who told me, I really respect David's work, but he's wrong on this. So I still am trying to figure out who's right.
Well, thanks for throwing me under the bus on that one.
I didn't mean it like that. I'm worried.
No, I mean, it's, I think how the city proceeds with layoffs is an open question. And I have talked, the city council thinks that it can appeal to the body in the city that is tasked with, litigating these sorts of things, the Public Safety Civil Service Commission. And they want to appeal to that commission and say, basically give us the green light to lay people off out of order. I have talked to the executive director on that, and this has never been tested before. Like there's not a very clear rule on how this gets done. So even the person who eventually will decide whether or not this can be allowed has not come up with an answer of how that's going to go. And so, I'm not going to get. I probably shouldn't get into a back and forth on legal issues with the former U.S. Attorney of Western Washington, as somebody who has not gone to law school. But the question of how realistic that is, I think, is legitimately an open one.
Okay. Well, let's talk about, since we're talking about policing, the Seattle Police Department faced another test this week with the Kentucky grand jury deciding not to charge the officers who shot and killed Breonna Taylor. Some Seattleites took to the street, mostly peacefully, of course, but some smashed windows and parking meters and threw bottles. David, how did the police respond?
They responded how we've seen them respond pretty consistently. There was some back and forth. There was pepper spray used, blast balls used. The bike officers used their bicycles to create barriers and try and move people. For anybody who has been following the protests of this whole summer, what we saw over the last few days is not atypical, and I would say not atypical from what we've seen actually over the last few years. This is this cycle that we saw in May Day for years, and now we're seeing here, where there just doesn't seem to be these protests. Nobody has really figured out a way to do these quietly or without controversy.
Was there tear gas this week in Seattle? I know a federal judge had said, ordered Seattle not to use tear gas on peaceful protesters. But we all know that protesters get chaotic, and the peaceful get mixed in with the not peaceful. And then there's tear gas versus pepper spray. Can somebody help me understand how, Jennifer, how are police responding now, and how did they respond this week in terms of non-lethal crowd control?
Based on video that I saw surfacing from the grounds of the recent protests and people taking to the street, we saw, even with that one video that, a lot of people have now seen, with the officer whose head was hit by a person with a bat. He used pepper spray. And there is a difference between tear gas, which is CS, different chemical compounds. I wish I could explain it better, but pepper spray is different than tear gas. And I know even just, a couple months ago, when there was a lot of police force and attention shown on the streets of Seattle, and a lot of damage, there wasn't any tear gas used. I haven't heard recently, but I can say for sure, based on video, that pepper spray was used.
Eli, what's your response to police actions regarding the Breonna Taylor protest this week?
Well, there's the video of the officer getting hit with a bat, which is, of course, concerning. And then there's also the video that shows an officer riding his bike over the head of, I assume it was a protester, someone who is prone on the ground. And that is also extremely disturbing. Imagine having someone stand on your head. That's essentially the force of having the wheel of a bike plus the officer on the bike go over your head, front wheel, and then back wheel. And so that is not behavior that we should be seeing from anyone, never mind people who are paid taxpayer money to defend our right to peacefully protest and defend everyone's constitutional right to live in peace. And that officer is now on paid leave, and there's going to be, it sounds like, an independent investigation by an outside agency, the King County Sheriff's Office, which is as it should be. And, you know, I know that there is concern about the entire police department sometimes getting maligned by the actions of a few officers, or in this case, one officer. You know, this is pretty clearly egregious behavior by this officer if what's captured on the video is accurate. And I hear that concern, but I think it's also fair to say no officer should behave like that, and no officer should be employing, or I'm sorry, no department should be employing an officer who behaves like that. And so if the Seattle Police Department does not want to be, you know, maligned for having officers ride over someone's head on a bike, then that should just not happen.
Minor point, it looked to me like the officer was walking his bike over this person's head, but as you say, front and back. Eli, you look skeptical.
You know, that's not what I saw. Maybe I have to watch the video again. I read reports of the officer walking the bike, but I thought, as a former bike messenger, maybe I've misunderstood something, but I thought that was a term of art, you know, for biking, where you kind of walk your bike by lifting one tire and then the other while you're riding it over a raised object. So that's how I took it. Maybe I'm wrong. Someone else who's
from what I saw, he was actually off to the side. He was not straddling his bicycle. But in some ways, that was seen as he could have more easily avoided the person, because it's not like the officer had all this momentum moving forward or something. That, I mean, it seems fairly clear that the officer was walking his bike, rolled one wheel over this person's head, and then continued and rolled the back wheel over this person's head as well. I think that is part of the controversy.
Oh, well, I'm happy to be corrected on that. I misunderstood, and I guess the video wasn't clear.
Well, in any case, I went to talk a little with the mayor about this, and she said, well, and if that was intentional, he should be fired. And I said, well, it looked to me like it was intentional, but I'm not an investigator. But is this going to wrap around whether the officer intended it or not? And will an investigation get into that and decide, you know, if the officer says, oh, it was an accident, then what happened? So I don't know. We'll see about that. Jennifer, any other comments about police cuts and response this week? It was a big week for policing in Seattle.
Yeah, it really was. Just to say that, you know, this is not going anywhere. I think that we're going to continue to just hear from people and see people take to the streets until, you know, they feel like justice has been met, until they feel like the reform and changes that they've been speaking out for have been met, and their voices have not only been heard, but action also taken with legislation. So, I mean, yes, we've had several months, of unrest in the streets, if you want to call it that. And I don't think that it's going to end with a change in season.
Any other final thoughts on policing before we cover other topics on the week in review?
Just to say that I apologize again if I misunderstood what the officer was doing in that video, but I do agree with what the mayor is saying. The police department shouldn't be employing someone who even walks a bike over someone's head.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and going forward, we also have, in addition to all of the budget questions and all of that going on, there's also the question of the police contract, which is about to expire at the end of this year, that the city has not begun to negotiate yet. So that will be something that will have pretty big implications for policing in Seattle going forward.
And the budget debate continues next week with Mayor Durkin about to propose her 2021 budget. So we'll keep following it here on the Week in Review. You're listening to Cure 13 reporter Jennifer Lee, Crosscut reporter David Kroman. Eli Sanders is here, author of the Wild West newsletter, which he's going to tell us more about. And you can watch us, by the way, doing the whole thing at facebook.com/KUOW Public Radio, or at youtube.com/user/KUOW 949. As we're recapping the news of the week for you, we're going to take a quick break and be right back. Stay tuned.
Support for KUOW comes from neighborhood Fred Meyer stores, providing fresh food and the ability to personalize shopping on the Fred Meyer app or in store. Fred Meyer, fresh for everyone.
94.9 KUOW, Seattle's NPR news station. It's 12:27 and it's KUOW's Week in Review.
I'm Bill Radke. Thanks for tuning in today. It's gotten harder for journalists to give you the facts. The internet has sucked the money out of media companies, and the pandemic recession has made it worse. And you can do something about that. KUOW is in the final 6 hours of the fall pledge drive. We started out needing to raise $1 million by the end of the month, and we're down to 270,000, closing that gap. Can you chip in and help out with that? Here's how to do it. Go to KUOW.org and be a monthly evergreen supporter of this radio station. Give us a call at 206 if you want, 206-543-9595. That's 543-9595. Tell your smart speaker to donate to KUOW, or you can text the 4 letters KUOW to the number 41444. That's 41444. My guests are Crosscut's David Kroman, Q13's Jennifer Lee, and Eli Sanders. No longer with The Stranger, Eli. Here we're talking about shrinking media companies. Could The Stranger no longer afford your Pulitzer Prize-winning self? Or why else have you started your new foray into journalism, Eli?
You know, I had a real nice long run at The Stranger. I was writing for the paper for more than 15 years, and I'm really grateful for my time there and proud of what I've done there. But for me, it was just time for something new. And if you've read the New York Times this week, you'll see that there is a trend right now of journalists hopping off of traditional media platforms and into, like I tried to say earlier with the bad connection, the wild yonder of email newsletters. And this can sound a little like AOL 1996 stuff, an email newsletter, but there's this resurgence of email newsletters now that are merged with micropayment platforms. And what results is, for a number of journalists, the ability to make a pretty decent living by just publishing through your email newsletter once a week or many times a week, 5 days a week if you want, and having your readers support your work. And you can do that through an email newsletter without a massively huge audience, which could be kind of a balm, I guess, for a lot of journalists who have been shrunken out of media over the last decade or so, and also a way of just improving the quality of journalism offerings for local communities and for the country as a whole.
And tell us about the newsletter topic that you've chosen.
So my newsletter is going to focus on the intersection of technology and democracy, which, if you ask me, is an intersection that we should all be paying attention to right now. It's obviously one that's affecting our politics. It's affecting the current election. It's affecting our culture. It's affecting the way we relate to each other, or, you know, the way I talk to you now. And it's going to look at the intersection of democracy and technology through the lens of one and maybe two very big but overlooked cases that are going on right now in Washington State. The first one is Washington State versus Facebook. And if you haven't heard of it, you can find out more about it on the newsletter. But the short is that the Attorney General of Washington State, Bob Ferguson, has sued Facebook, the largest social media platform in the world, worth way more than the annual budget of Washington State, over Facebook's refusal to follow Washington State law. And one of Facebook's claims in court is that it doesn't have to follow Washington State law. In this case, our election law requiring transparency in election ads. And remember, Facebook election ads are an issue that really affected the 2016 election. But Facebook is saying it doesn't have to follow Washington State law in this respect because the law is unconstitutional, among many other reasons. And so in this newsletter, I'm going to be digging into this argument. It ends up being an argument over the First Amendment and, from Washington State's perspective, the right of a state to enforce rules for its own election and the need for an informed democracy. That's just one facet of what's a really interesting case that's going to unfold over time, and I think therefore lends itself to updates in a kind of weekly format in a weekly newsletter.
David Kroman, you're coming from your perch at Crosscut. What is your take on forays like this into single subject journalistic newsletters and kind of the state of local media in general?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's well, as far as how I feel about the state of local media in general, I would say not good generally. But as far as how I feel about forays like Eli's, or I think of Erica Barnett, she has it's not a newsletter, but has similarly kind of created this model around these micro donations that Eli mentioned. I think is a great alternative, and one that really breaks down barriers between the journalist and the people who enjoy reading those journalists. I think it works well for Eli, or I think it will work well for Eli, and I think it works well for Erica because they've been around for a while. They're names that are well known in the city. And so from that perspective, and do sort of focused, deep digging journalism. And so I think there's a lot of market for that. At the same time, I don't think that is going to supplant something like the Seattle Times if they're okay now. But if the Seattle Times were to continue to struggle long term, I think there's certain points of coverage where you don't really need a journalist with a ton of branding to deliver the sort of news that you need, school board meetings or city council meetings and things like that. I don't think Eli is going to grow a huge audience by just showing up and being a stenographer for a city council meeting. But I do think that's necessary. And so while I think these sort of forays into newsletters are great and are going to be super important for journalism going forward, I also don't think it is an answer or a silver bullet to the broader issues happening in local media right now.
Jennifer, what does it look like to you from Q13?
Well, first I'll tell Eli that he definitely has my attention. I think that's so interesting. And I also really respect and admire the fact that, he's so brave in pursuing what his interests and passions are. And I think that's really what's attractive to readers who will end up subscribing to his newsletter. So I think that's really exciting. I will say, I think every company is in this COVID economy that is very challenging when it comes to looking at a budget sheet. And, I've heard from across the country, newsrooms who are losing good journalists. And it does make me sad because it's, to no one's fault really, but, this current state of affairs with the coronavirus and the impact that it's had. I think journalism will always be valuable. And I just think that it depends on, who you are. Are you someone who likes to just get your information quick, look on your phone, or, turn on the TV while you're cooking dinner? But I think for people who truly want to, get their facts from a place, let's say a personality, kind of like David and Eli were speaking of, I think there's good journalism out there basically for everyone's palate. And I hope that continues to be the case.
Yeah, my concern is, Eli and folks like Eli, you got their chops and their reputation via, basically traditional news outlets, if you want to call The Stranger a traditional news outlet, which I think it is. But how do you, we all know that the state of alt weeklies right now is not good. So if alt weeklies disappear, where does the next Eli come from? I don't know, and that's kind of what I'm concerned about. Is we are seeing the end. We're seeing the result of a pipeline leading into something that I think is good and positive and productive. But what happens when that pipeline goes away?
I really share David's concern, and I don't think that newsletters should or will replace traditional newsrooms. I hope that doesn't happen. I want the Seattle Times to stay strong, and I would like the Stranger to stay strong. But I do just want to throw something out there that I think is very exciting about newsletters. So take this person that David's referring to, who is maybe earlier in their career than me, but has enough journalism experience to cover a city council meeting or cover the city. they can throw their hat in the ring of subscription newsletters and try to grow a newsletter through their coverage. And to get to a number of subscribers that would make it worth their while is not just an impossible goal. The average payment right now, I think, or the sort of going rate for email newsletters is $5 a month for the subscription. So as a journalist, you only need 1,000 people, and there are probably 1,000 people in the city of Seattle who are interested in city council meetings, for example. You only need 1,000 people subscribing to your newsletter at $5 a month to earn more than a lot of journalists are making in Seattle. Now, I don't want to encourage everyone to rush out and start a newsletter because it is not easy actually to get to 1,000 or even 2,000. But those are the numbers we're talking about. You don't need 100,000 subscribers. And if you had 100,000 subscribers at $5 a month, you could then go out and start your own media organization because you'd have a lot of money.
If you left your company to publish a newsletter, Jennifer, have you ever thought about what it would be about? What's Jennifer's one topic that you're going to bring us?
Okay, so don't laugh, but I'm kind of obsessed with grocery stores. So
I'm listening.
So I think it started in one of my previous news markets, Rochester, New York. I'm a huge fan of Wegmans. And, life just was never the same again after having all these Wegmans around. So basically they're family owned and operated grocery chain. You guys may have heard of them. They're mostly based out of the Northeast, and they kind of go down a little south of the Mason-Dixon. But yeah, they do a great job of customer service and branding. So when I walk into a grocery store, the way that I view the store layout and everything is very different. So, I mean, in my wildest of dreams, as someone who, loves interpreting and gathering information and sharing that would be it.
You would blog about grocery store layouts.
Layouts, produce, customer service, you name it, top to bottom.
Got it. David, what about you?
I don't think I'm going to start a newsletter. I don't know. I never say never, but I'm actually curious to hear from you, Eli, because I feel like a few years ago we saw this huge influx of newsletters that became this, like, everyone was obsessed with newsletters, and it was not so much the independent individuals as it is now, maybe, but every news outlet was just like, that was the way they were going to grow their audience, was through these newsletters. It seemed to sort of hit a saturation point to a certain extent. At least I thought. Maybe I'm wrong, but I'm curious, like, if you think if this shift is different from that other sort of obsession with newsletters, and why you think this will succeed, where in a market where it seems like we already have a lot of newsletters.
I do think this is different. Those newsletters that were put out by media companies were essentially attempts to grow the media company's audience and often sell ads against the newsletters. So you would get the newsletter, but it would have ads in it. And I know what you mean about subscribing to a lot of newsletters, but I think it's mostly journalists who subscribe to every outlet's newsletter. I don't think the average person did. And for the average person, for the consumer here, the newsletter is an opportunity to say, hey, in this kind of hellscape of decreasing journalism and a lot of bad journalism, here's an opportunity to financially support the kind of journalism that I want. And I don't have to go sort through my Facebook feed or Twitter or whatever to dig it out of the waterfall of cascading nonsense. I just get it showing up in my inbox at a regularly expected time, and I open it up, and I know I'm going to get something quality, and I'm paying for it, so I know I'm contributing to that quality. And the minute I don't like it, I stop paying for it, and I go support something else.
All right. Well, we're going to pause there and continue to cover the news that the journalists cover. That's the Wild West newsletter, which you can sign up for at wildwest.substack.com. So back to the news of the week. I want to find out, Jennifer, about this news from Tacoma. We don't have a coronavirus vaccine. We don't have herd immunity. Why are some Tacoma students going back into public school buildings on Monday?
Yeah, this is a model that, a lot of districts will be following should they decide to have this phased in reopening. Of course, they all have different timelines, but just based on, studies and research, there are some people who really, or groups of children who really will not get the full extent of the, learning, social, emotional development that they need. And this includes the age groups of pre-K, kindergarten, as well as special education. So, educators do want to try and get them into a classroom type setting sooner than, let's say, our older learners in high school. But, just recently, Tacoma Public Schools, which is the third largest district in our state, had original plans of reopening for, that group of children starting on Monday. But just yesterday, they said because of new guidance that came down from the State Department of Labor and Industries regarding N95 masks, that they were not ready. They weren't ready to put their staff out there with the new training, as well as N95 fitting guidelines that they just learned of.
I hadn't heard this. So you're saying the kindergarten and special ed students are not going back to school on Monday in Tacoma?
In Tacoma, no.
Okay. What is it about the N95 training? What's the problem?
So based on the conversations that I've had with the president of the Education Association in Tacoma, as well as information that the Tacoma School District released, they basically said that, they found that based on research, even some of the N95 masks they do have were proven to be ineffective. It's something that they're working on. They already have a vendor that they're working on to get their staff trained up on N95 safety. And, this is something that we've continued to hear since the COVID outbreak about how if you're not wearing an N95 mask properly and it's not properly fitted to your face, it really doesn't do what it's supposed to do. And so this group of employees within the district include counselors who wouldn't have that large classroom space, it'd be a smaller office, staff who work with children in special education who, aren't able to put on a mask, nurses who would be dealing with, children who could have symptoms. So I think there are still a lot of details to learn. The district said they could be getting even more new information again next week. And also going back to unions and rules, the teachers union is guaranteed 5 days notice before the next date that they'd have to have children back into the classroom. So it's definitely going to be another week at the very least.
Okay. Meanwhile, Zoom learning, online learning continues in Tacoma and other places. I've heard rumblings of different school districts talking about going to a hybrid model, bringing some kids back. You could see why some special ed kids who have personalized learning plans, just screen learning, it doesn't work. 5-year-olds, it's hard to get a kindergartner to learn much on a screen, keep their attention. They need to get their wiggles out. And by the way, I think my kids are older than this. If I had to go into work, I could leave my kids alone learning remotely at home. But, especially for the younger kids, school is also daycare, and a lot of that becomes an issue as well. Any other, David or Eli, any other thoughts on back to school or not back to school?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've said this before, but it feels like the summer was, we had a lot of talk about how do we open up restaurants again? How do we open up bars again? And maybe some of that was this expectation that the virus would be more under control right now than it is. But it seems like that the conversations around restaurants and bars and venues has slowed a little bit. And I think that's partially because it's a realization that if you really want the economy to actually function properly again, you need to have schools working. And so therefore, it's worth putting sort of effort into bringing down the case numbers on behalf of schools, perhaps is more worthwhile than bringing down the numbers on behalf of bars and restaurants.
Did you hear about a bunch of restaurant and bar owners, including Ethan Stoll and Tom Douglas, signing a petition trying to get the governor to allow alcohol sales. Some say up to 2 a.m., some say midnight, because currently it's 10 o'clock. And some of these bar and restaurant owners are saying, you gotta trust us to. Some restaurant owners aren't even following the protocols, but we are, and we should be able to. We can handle this. We should be able to sell alcohol and make some money and survive. So it's schools, restaurants, Husky football is about to start up. They got the okay. You can see different sectors of our economy and our pop culture life trying to lurch back into existence.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
As health officials warn that we are likely to see a huge spike in cases, partly because of this and partly because of the realities of fall and people spending more time indoors. So my major reaction at the moment to all of this is just, sympathy for everyone who is trying to navigate this. Just take the parents of kindergartners and the teachers and the unions for the teachers and the administrators. This is not easy stuff. And so this may sound like worthless self-help speak, but, it's okay to give yourself a break or feel like this is hard or not be performing your best, because we are all dealing with something that none of us were thinking about for the most part a year ago. And it's super challenging.
Again, that news, in case you hadn't heard that, the Pac-12, the Pacific 12 Sports Conference yesterday, the Huskies, Cougars, Ducks, Trojans, the Western schools announced that, like the rest of the country, football is going to happen after all in the West. There's going to be 7 Pac-12 games starting on November 6th, ending the week before Christmas. Husky players are back on campus. They got back last week. They're quarantining now, and they start practicing on Tuesday. Not all Pac-12 schools can practice yet. The Colorado Buffalo players are on lockdown because 1,200 Colorado students and staff tested positive this week for COVID-19. This is the Week in Review, and we're going to be right back.
Support for KUOW comes from Geico, offering auto insurance coverage for cars, trucks, or SUVs, and providing 24/7 customer service. More information on auto insurance at geico.com/Seattle or 1-800-947-AUTO.
KUOW FM Seattle, KUOW Tumwater, KQOW Bellingham. Just about 10 minutes till 1 o'clock. Let's return to KUOW's Week in Review.
I'm Bill Radke. We're breaking down the news of the week with you and Eli Sanders, author of the Wild West newsletter, Crosscut reporter David Kroman, and Q13 reporter Jennifer Lee. The November election, that's when Americans get to have their say. But will that message be clear, and will the president listen?
Will you commit to making sure that there is a peaceful transferal of power after the election?
Well, we're going to have to see what happens. You know that I've been complaining very strongly about the ballots, and the ballots are a disaster.
I understand that, but people are rioting. Do you commit to making sure that there's a peaceful transferal of power?
We want to get rid of the ballots, and you'll have a very peaceful. There won't be a transfer, frankly. There'll be a continuation. The ballots are out of control. You know it. And you know who knows it better than anybody else? The Democrats know it better than anybody else. Go ahead.
Get rid of the ballots. I think he's talking there about mail-in ballots, kind of. Something which, by the way, we are quite used to in Washington State. It's just called ballots. Eli, several Republican Congress members reacted to the president's statements by saying, reassuring us there will be a peaceful transfer of American power, as there has been since 1792. So who's right?
Well, I hope they're right. If we don't have a peaceful transfer of power, something very dramatic and I think awful has happened. And, it's nice to see Republican senators finally drawing a line. I guess the line that they're going to draw forcefully is we can't actually completely throw our democracy in the trash. We do have to have a peaceful transfer of power. So they're going to get up and say that, even as President Trump is twice this week, suggesting that he doesn't feel like the peaceful transfer of power, which is the bedrock that our democracy is built on, is all that necessary. It's very concerning stuff. There's an article in The Atlantic right now that I think everyone should pay attention to. It asks the question of whether this election is the one that is going to break our democracy. And it looks at what Trump is saying, but it also looks at what his campaign has been doing to undermine the vote and to sort of prepare itself to call into question the legitimacy of the election in what the author calls the interregnum, the in-between period between the election and Inauguration Day, which I think is something like 70 days. It's a long period to go, with the president potentially saying, well, I don't believe it was all rigged, and Joe Biden potentially saying, I'm the legitimate president, and the rest of us doing what? And I think that is a question, that what am I doing and what am I going to do, that everyone does need to be asking themselves. This article is not alarmist. I think it's very clear-eyed, and it encourages people ultimately to ask themselves that question, and it suggests some answers for the average citizen and people who are in positions of power. For the average citizen, it says, particularly I think for people in Washington State, we have a pretty well-functioning mail-in system. If you are on social media or connected to people who are persuadable, right, or who are open-minded, talk to them about the baselessness of the attacks on mail-in voting. Try to counter-program this false narrative that mail-in voting can't be trusted and that our elections are untrustworthy and rigged. They're really not. And then there's a whole list of advice for people in all kinds of different positions of power. Journalists have to do their role to defend democracy. Police officers and police chiefs have to do their role to defend the right of people to go to polling stations in states where there are still polling stations without interference. Judges should probably refamiliarize themselves with election law, and on and on. And what the author concludes is that, if Trump's aim is really to trample American democracy in order to stay in power, which if you take him at his word, that does sound like his aim, then the only way he can do that is, the author writes, is if in some measure the American people acquiesce to it. And so the encouragement from this article, and it is pretty dire, but I think we are in a dire moment, the encouragement is, do not acquiesce.
Jennifer, is Washington State a model of mail-in ballot legitimacy?
100%. I mean, I think Washington has shown, just based on evidence over the years, that it can be done. And I think everything points to the fact that voter turnout is higher in mail-in ballot states, if you just look at the information. So this is something that I recently had a conversation with someone who has a background in history as well as politics, and I found very interesting. A lot of political analysts are expecting this election to be very close, which could be motivating certain actions behind the people who are in power. But that's not to say President Trump, if he does end up getting that second term, there you have it. He'll have his second term. And, based on what we've seen before, presidents are usually more emboldened to take the kind of action that they want to do, knowing that, they don't have another election. And then let's say Joe Biden ends up winning this election. And, hopefully that transfer of power is a smooth process. That doesn't mean that Donald Trump is going to just go away. I mean, he has a right to run again, let's say, in the scenario that if Joe Biden were to win for another second term. But I think there's a lot of conversation and analysis, and I hope that people will take pride in just knowing their facts, as well as also, it's stressful leading up to the elections, especially with everything that's going on, but also be able to take enjoyment out of American democracy and, what it has shown itself as something that we practice as American citizens.
Well, we're about to see how enjoyable it is, David. We're not a swing state. So does that mean we shouldn't expect chaos here?
I mean, I think Washington's system functions exactly how it's supposed to, but the problem is for the rest of the country that's not used to that. So they look at the fact, I often think about Councilmember Shamasawa in her last election. On election night, she was down by about 9 points. And then over the course of the next week, as late ballots were counted, there's historically a bias, not to use that term negatively, but a bias towards sort of more liberal progressive candidates in local races. So as those late ballots were coming in, the vote tally swung pretty dramatically for her. And then of course she ended up winning by 3 points. That's how the system is supposed to work. Nothing broke there. That was a perfectly legitimate election. And yet we saw a lot of national media outlets cover that election as if she had lost before when she actually went on to go win. And so I agree with Jennifer that Washington's system is a model. It is pretty rock solid, at least as far as you can get. But I don't think that means it will be without its problems, in part because of a lot of misinformation. Donald Trump, after the Florida election, tweeted that they should stop counting late arriving ballots. There was nothing illegal about those, but he was concerned that Rick Scott was starting to fall behind in late arriving ballots. There was no fraud. It was all perfectly legal and legitimate, but he was still putting out this information that somehow these late arriving ballots were less legitimate when they weren't. And so that's the real concern.
Eli?
And what David's talking about here is something national strategists have taken to calling the blue shift. We are way ahead of the curve in Washington state in getting used to this and getting used to the idea that the election doesn't end on election night. There are still going to be ballots to be counted, and it can really change the results. But think back to when this first started here in Washington. That's where most of the rest of the country is. They're not used to thinking in that way. And what the Atlantic article points out is that Republicans are very openly, they're not hiding this. They are preparing to take advantage of that unfamiliarity with the blue shift. And people who are concerned about this talk about it another way. They talk about the red mirage, that on election night, it could look like Trump is winning a number of states that he ultimately won't because of the blue shift that will occur as more ballots are counted. But while those ballots are being counted, expect Republicans to say, these ballots are fraudulent, illegitimate, stop counting, what are you doing? The result is the result on election night. And from that, we could potentially get a lot of unfortunate chaos and misinformation.
Hey, we have just enough time to find a ray of hope, piercing the gloom. Maybe it's baby orcas. I don't know. Anything making you still able to smile today?
Yeah, the baby orca. That's good news. That's 2 baby orcas in a month. That's
a
really
fellow
positive.
reporter's reaction was, "Oh, it's a boy instead of a girl. It's bad for reproduction." Oh,
Jeez.
There's that object.
Yeah.
That space object that's coming into view, and they're not quite sure what it is, and might come into near Earth orbit, I think I read in the Seattle Times. My thought was, oh, good, they're coming to rescue us.
Is that what it is?
Maybe.
Yeah, they don't know if it's space junk or if it's an asteroid or what, but maybe a mini moon getting pulled into our gravity.
I hope it's a mini moon.
We'll take it.
Yeah, it's supposed to be sunny next week. Take it each day at a time.
The sun and the moon, they're still doing their thing. Hard to believe. Man, look at it rain outside, and the sky kind of looks like it's not smoke, folks. That's just cloud cover. Remember that? It's just autumn. Thank you so much for being with me on the Week in Review. David Kroman from Crosscut, Jennifer Lee from Q13. Eli Sanders is author of the Wild West newsletter. Thanks to all of you. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Bill.
Thanks, Bill.
Produced by Sarah Leibovitz, and we get help from Juan Pablo Chiquiza and Tio Popescu, enabling us to be on Zoom and be visual. We hope you'll make your pledge.